Our next step is to separate the caffeine from the dichloromethane. And to do this, we're going to run a simple distillation. Now, in a simple distillation like this, we're going to be running it all the way to dryness, which can be challenging to control the temperature. Because once it's dry, that temperature tends to skyrocket. And we don't want that because caffeine will be damaged. It'll basically burn at higher temperatures. So we need to control that temperature. So that's why if you notice on my hot plate, I have a glass dish with water in it. That water is going to allow us to keep that temperature at a manageable level. So the water will get heated up and that'll keep that temperature at a constant about 70 degrees. It'll be a little lower than that just because of the cooling effect of the fume hood. But we're going to set our hot plate to between 70 and 80 degrees, and we're going to run our distillation all the way until all of the dichloromethane is gone. Notice on the left side, I've got everything set up with corks so that we have a nice seal going to a 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer flask. We are going to be collecting all of our dichloromethane because we can recycle it, and we'll make sure we do that. So go ahead and set this up on the lab bench to start with, and then once everything's ready, once you know the heights of everything, we'll move it all to the fume hood and we can get our distillation set up. With everything set up here, we're going to put our Florence flask into our glass dish. So I've got all of my corks set up. I'm going to attach it. I don't want it to bottom out in the glass dish. I want to be suspended in the water. So we're going to get everything nice and tightly sealed, make sure everything is secure. And then we're going to turn on our hot plate, set it to about 70 degrees. And then we should already have our condenser turned on. And then we're just going to let the distillation run. Once our distillation is done and we've got a dry product in our Florence flask, the next thing we need to do is get that caffeine out of the Florence flask. The easiest way to do this is going to be just use a little bit more of the DCM. So just add about 5 milliliters into the flask, swirl it all around, make sure everything gets absorbed, and then we're going to add that DCM just into a large test tube. And I do this off camera. Then we take that test tube, we'll set up a small beaker, put it on that hot plate, get it to a higher temperature, and then just set that beaker into that steaming water. So that water doesn't need to be boiling, it just needs to be above 40 degrees Celsius, and then all of the DCM will evaporate, and we'll have nice crude caffeine in our test tube. And then we can do a recrystallization to get a pure product. Now I take the test tube out of the water. We can see along the sides I have some dirty caffeine. So now we need to do a recrystallization. And we're going to do that using 95% ethanol. Ethanol is very good at dissolving caffeine at a higher temperature, but really bad at it at a lower temperature. So we're just going to add about 2 to 2.5 milliliters. We want to use a very small amount of ethanol. We're going to place this into the test tube. We don't want to use any more than we need to. So here you can see me swirling it around. I'm putting it back into the hot water to heat up the ethanol. Ethanol evaporates. It'll boil at about 80 degrees Celsius. So we want to make sure we're keeping it under that. We don't want any of the ethanol to boil. We just want to warm it up so that it dissolves the caffeine better. It's going to take a little while. This took me probably 10 to 15 minutes to get all of it to dissolve. In between using a glass stir rod, I added a little bit more ethanol as I was going through this, and just keeping it warm until all of that caffeine dissolves. And now you can see here that we have a fairly clear solution. It's hard to see on the camera, but it is nice and clear. Now we need to cool down that ethanol so that the caffeine precipitates out. And in our next step, we're going to need some cold ethanol to wash that caffeine. So fill up a second large test tube with some ethanol. And then place both of your test tubes into a test tube rack. And then we want to put a cork into both of those test tubes. And then take it away, give it to me, and I will put it in the freezer in the staff lounge. And the next day, we are going to filter off our final product. So we can see here that I've got my caffeine that is now solid. And all we need to do now is filter off that ethanol. So I've got a piece of filter paper. I'm going to place that into my Buchner funnel. It should all be clean. And I'm just going to hit it with a little bit of water after I turn on the vacuum pump. And that's to get that filter to seal nicely into the funnel. Now, once it is sealed, we can go ahead and use a little spatula to get the caffeine out of our test tube, and the vacuum filter will pull all the ethanol off. And here I'm making sure I'm getting all of that caffeine into that funnel. And then I'm going to let the vacuum run for probably about 2 minutes. After the vacuum pump has been running for a couple minutes, I'm going to use a pipette. I'm going to grab some of that really cold ethanol, and I'm going to spray that onto the caffeine on any spots that look less than nice, pure white. And so I'm just trying to dissolve a little bit of the impurities that might have still carried over. This should not be much. This should be a very small amount. And then we're just going to let that vacuum pump run and dry those caffeine crystals under that pump. Once they're dry, we're going to turn off our faucet and then use a pair of tongs to remove the filter and place it onto a watch glass. We're then going to put this into the drying oven to let it fully dry, and then we'll be able to look at our final caffeine. So now I'm just going to take that nice white fluffy caffeine and I'm going to scrape it onto a watch glass so that we can clearly see what it should look like. Now, you are going to want to figure out your final yield, and to do that, you will need to have taken the mass of the filter paper, and then once everything's dry, put that filter paper back onto a scale, just subtract that mass, and then you'll know your final yield of caffeine.